Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 11 of Race and Gender in the History of Photography in the United States. Today, I'm going to be speaking with you about culture wars and the AIDS crisis. This takes us from the 70s up to the early 1990s. Today's lecture will begin with an introduction to queer photography of the 70s and 80s. Then we will move on to the AIDS crisis, the group ACT UP and its artistic branch called Grand Fury. Then we'll spend some time looking at Nicholas Nixon's Photographs of People, an exhibition. And finally, I will set you up with some questions for the Moodle discussion forum for this week. So we've seen a couple of examples of photography that images queer identities. Obviously, and here are two of them. Obviously, these exist throughout the history of photography. But in the 1970s, a critical mass of artists and cultural workers using photography to challenge the sexual status quo starts to really gain momentum. And by the mid-1980s, it is motivated by the urgency of the AIDS crisis. This photographic production intersects with the rightward turn of politics in the 1980s, so that in the 1980s and early 1990s, photography becomes this cultural flashpoint for debates over the visibility of queer bodies, lives, and desire. I want to note that I'm using the word queer as an umbrella term for LGBTQIA+, but also as a word that refers to an action, that action being the destabilization of normative gender identities and sexualities. The late 80s, early 90s is the time period when this term was being reclaimed from a slur to a point of proud identification through activist groups such as Queer Nation and also in academia by various scholars. So moving on now to queer photography in the 70s and 80s. In the late 70s and 80s, the period immediately following the post-gay liberation movement, there is this impetus to make queer identities and lives visible through portraiture. And we might think about the fact that Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected politician in California, owned a camera shop. There are, and we will see different strategies by photographers. Some take a more documentary approach, and some tend toward the abstract. I will show a few examples. This is the work of Joan Byron, a Mount Holyoke alum, who self-published her book, Eye to Eye, Portraits of Lesbians, in 1979. It showed photographs like this one, documenting the everyday life of lesbians, and she meant for it to fill a representational void. I'll read this quote. Quote, "I wanted to be a photographer in large part because I needed to see images of lesbians, and it was a visceral thing. I wanted a reflection of my reality, and I think everybody wants that. My experience is that there's an enormous hunger among people to be able to see themselves. You know, people want to see themselves in photographs. They want to see themselves on TV. They want to see themselves in film. It's always an enormous emotional high the first time you see something that is you in that medium. And that is because there's this huge hunger for the kind of validation that comes from seeing a reflection. And part of why I've devoted my life to what I call making the invisible visible is for that reason." Other photographers, instead of taking a documentary approach, created images with more of an abstract quality. And this is the case with the work of T. Corinne, who created more sexually explicit imagery, which meant that she had to contend with the history of lesbian imagery made by men for men. So she often used solarization and multiple prints, not only to keep identities anonymous, but also to make it sort of impossible or less possible for her images to be used or reused as pornography for men. Here are a couple of other examples by Corinne. The image on the left, which she entitled The Three Graces, shows three women who broke from stereotypical ideals of beauty, either in their age or their body type. She refused to photograph only young, white, slender women. The image on the right is, you can see she's arranged multiple prints of the same photograph together to create this yantra, this pattern that adds another layer to the explicitness of the imagery, and in fact forms an additional kind of subject matter through its form, other than lesbian sexuality. I wanted to note that in 1984, On Our Backs was first published. This is the first erotica magazine run by women, and it featured lesbian erotica for lesbians. It was published in New York and again started in 1984. In gay male communities, there were also approaches that were more documentary and those that were more abstract. This is the work of Robert Mapplethorpe, who took a more documentary approach, documenting gay male culture from bodybuilders to BDSM practitioners. And now, I suppose, is as good a time as any to mention this overlap between art photography and pornography, another use of photography we haven't talked much about yet in this class. These photographers realized that in order to make images of queer sexual desire, they also had to engage with histories of pornography. And in the gay male community, there were photographers who adopted a more abstract approach to photography. This is the case with a photographer such as David Wojnarowicz, whose work you see here. He also used reversal, like T. Corinne, in order to find a way to show this graphic gay sexual encounter. So the images that I've just shown are a couple of the many, many queer photographers working in the 1970s and 80s. In the 1980s, this imagery intersected with a public health crisis that greatly impacted the queer community. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. AIDS was first discovered in 1981 when it was referred to as the gay flu, or a gay-related immune disease. Reagan was inaugurated as president the year before this. His government was incredibly slow to respond to the crisis, likely because he had been elected by a Christian conservative base that was very homophobic. By 1982, the CDC referred to the disease as AIDS. It took until 1985 for Reagan to finally utter this word in public. His administration did not request the appropriation of funds for AIDS research until May of 1983, which is 2 years after the disease was discovered. And even then, AIDS research was chronically underfunded. Between the years of 1981 and 1987, 40,000 people in the United States died of AIDS. And by 1989, AIDS was the leading cause of death for men and women between the ages of 24 and 35. Queer artists responded to the politics of the 1980s by making their own media to bring attention to the AIDS crisis, to advocate for a pro-sex politics, and to create queer visibility on their own terms. You'll see in this image here, this slide here, in 1981, Reagan recommended cutting the National Endowment for the Arts budget by 50%. We'll get to why in a second. And in 1989, Serrano's Piss Christ, an image we'll see shortly, sets off a series of culture wars. In the film snippets that you will watch for this week, or that you have watched already, you will learn about ACT UP, which was a direct action activist group formed in 1987. Note, please, that I'm also only asking you to screen about 10 minutes of the film. It's a fantastic film, and you can watch the whole thing if you'd like to, but I'm only asking you for homework to watch about 10 minutes of it, so you'll see the particular snippets on Moodle. So in this film, United in Anger, you will learn about ACT UP, this direct action activist group, and you will also learn of ACT UP's affiliated anonymous art collective called Grand Fury, which produced the imagery for the group. In these clips, you will see film clips. You will see some of the imagery that Grand Fury made, including these two images. These are two of the most recognizable: "Silence equals death," and "The government has blood on its hands." Grand Fury also made images that appropriated photographs and recontextualized them. Here we have a photograph of President Ronald Reagan that's been turned into this poster with the word AIDSgate across the front of it. AIDSgate is an allusion to the Watergate scandal, the federal political scandal involving President Richard Nixon and his administration in the early 70s that resulted in the end of Nixon's presidency. In 1972, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C., and the Nixon administration attempted to cover up its involvement in the crime. So the term Watergate came to stand in for this range of sketchy, clandestine attempts to cover up any kind of illegal activities. So this image, this poster, is meant to be, just as the two previous images, are meant to be very easily readable. This bright color holds Reagan personally responsible, and it also likens the AIDS crisis to a political scandal. Furthermore, it calls out Reagan as the main offender of the AIDS crisis, directing the gaze away from people with AIDS, who were often thought of by conservatives as the problem, as sort of gay criminals. They're redirecting the gaze toward Reagan, the real offender, the real problem of the AIDS crisis, because of his slow response to its urgency. So let's spend a little bit of time now with this image. "Kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do." So it's also made by Grand Fury, ACT UP's anonymous art collective, and it was created for and it circulated as a bus panel, which meant that it was supposed to be easily read and quickly understood as it traveled on buses. So what is the message here, and how does Grand Fury get it across? First, it shows interracial couples having fun and kissing. Interracial couples of different genders, they're being playful, they're being sexy, and they're showing that it's okay, that it's not harming anyone, and that it's safe to kiss. It's also calling out the indifference of the conservative Reagan administration. One of the ways that the "Kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do" bus poster works, one of the ways in which it is meant to kind of capture our attention quickly, is that Grand Fury used the look of advertisements, such as these United Colors of Benetton ads, to craft their images. They wanted to be appealing, and part of the way that they did that was to follow popular trends. The United Colors of Benetton was a company that was actually quite controversial at this time. They printed various ads at the height of the AIDS epidemic, some of which were more like activist posters rather than advertisements that appeared to be selling anything. This one in particular shows what looks like an interracial lesbian couple and their baby. So it is noteworthy that ACT UP, or Grand Fury, chose to emulate this particular kind of advertising. This was intentionally provocative. This was socially progressive, and certainly didn't shy away from social issues. This is the type of advertising that ACT UP borrowed from. So other than creating compelling images that drew from advertising, such as "Kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do," ACT UP's artistic affinity groups also wanted to contest mainstream depictions of AIDS victims. This is an example of the kind of work that ACT UP aimed to counter and wanted to see much less of. This photograph was taken by Therese Frere, a journalism student, of the 32-year-old David Kirby. David Kirby was an AIDS activist in some of his last moments of his life, shown here with his family. The photograph was then printed in Life magazine. It's a heart-wrenching photograph to look at, showing this grieving, devastated family and this emaciated, gaunt AIDS victim on his deathbed. Some people felt that this kind of photograph humanized the AIDS crisis. ACT UP felt that it didn't, that it spectacularized suffering and reduced this man with AIDS to just his illness alone. The hands in this photograph are particularly striking. The young girl being held by her mother, tender hands, that sort of cluster of hands around David Kirby's body, including his own sort of twisted hands. And finally, those Christ-like hands on the wall behind him that appear to invite this suffering man away from the suffering to leave this behind and leave the realm of the living. The story continues. The story with this photograph continues after being printed in Life magazine and seen by however many thousands of people. Benetton then decided to appropriate it. They colorized and reprinted the photograph as an advertisement. Benetton here apparently saw an opportunity again to lean into an important social issue and to announce their company as progressive and unafraid to tackle difficult issues. With that said, neither is this advertisement selling any product, nor is it making a case for anything. There's no text, and this image can really be read in any kind of way. So we've seen that ACT UP took a cue from Benetton, and then that Benetton appropriated AIDS imagery that ACT UP itself did not even support. I should note that this Benetton ad is an intervention on the part of Benetton, who changed the context of the original photograph. Another source of protest from ACT UP activists was a 1988 exhibition of documentary photographer Nicholas Nixon's work called Photographs of People, which showcased 125 prints of the social documentary photographer's work, often series of the same people over time, such as sisters photographed over the years. It also included his most recent work, People with AIDS, a sequence of with sequences of 4 to 12 photographs per series of people with AIDS, intentionally showing as the disease progressed. For instance, Nixon photographed Thomas Moran from 1987 until just a few years before his death in February of 1988. And I will now scroll through those photographs silently. For me, there is a poignancy in seeing this utter wasting away in this series of photographs. We note the literal wasting away of his flesh in photographs. Emaciation has come to be sort of emblematic of AIDS. We see this along with the gradual dimming of the subject's ability to compose himself for the camera at all. In Moran's case, this series begins as a conventional posed portrait, but it ends in this kind of abandon in which he doesn't register the camera at all and his self-consciousness disappears. We note here the ability of photography to document the passing of time and to document death. We might be thinking of Sontag and her claim that every photograph is a photograph of a past moment or a dead moment. As in the case with most shocking photographs, some people hoped that their publication would humanize this AIDS crisis and encourage people to take it seriously, to imagine their friend or brother or lover had contracted the virus. And this was certainly Nixon's intention, the photographer. He stated that his intent with the photographs was to, quote, tell the story of AIDS, to show what the disease truly is, how it affects those who have it, their lovers, families, and friends, and that it is both the most devastating and the most important social a medial issue of our time, end quote. He believed that simply by showing these photographs, by people seeing them, that would be enough. ACT UP, however, organized a major protest of the exhibition because of photographs like these. At this protest, they handed out flyers contesting the representation of people with AIDS as they were shown in the show. So I'm putting this in here for you to read on your own, either now, you can just pause this, or from the Word document that I've uploaded to Moodle under week 11. So before Thursday, if you could take 5 to 10 minutes to read the ACT UP protest flyer, that was the screen before this, and if possible, contribute to the Moodle discussion forum by responding to one or some of these questions or to the comments or questions of your peers. Number one, what are ACT UP's objections to the photographs in this exhibition? Number two, how does this relate to our conversations about social documentary photography so far in this class? Number three, how do the visual strategies of ACT UP reflect the group's political point of view as compared with the photographs of Nixon? And finally, what do you think? Do you agree with ACT UP's critique of Nixon's photographs? Should these photographs be seen? To summarize this lecture, we see in this post-Stonewall moment a movement to make visible queer bodies, lives, and desires through photography. We've seen a range of photographic strategies from activist graphic work, such as this poster, to advertisements, to photographs that exist in the realm of fine art, and to those that play into the conventions of documentary photography.